Hi there, welcome back to yet another YouTube video. This video is going to cover how to assemble one of our many curly tail patterns, but if you don't have a curly tail pattern from us, or you're making your own pattern, or even have a different tail pattern from us, this should function fantastically as a generic guide as to how to assemble your very own fursuit tail at home. If you like our content, you should definitely check out our Patreon. Our Patreon has a variety of different tiers, all the way from $1 up to $50, and you can get things like monthly fursuit patterns delivered straight to your inbox, or even monthly fursuit making classes that you can attend live with us via Zoom, or even something smaller like weekly updates from our office. If you like our stuff and like what we make, definitely check out our brand new website store. We also have an Etsy if you're more confident with that, but our website store helps us subvert some of the crazy Etsy fees that do exist. So if you wanted to shop with us and wanted to support us in the best way possible, our store on our website is the way to do that. Both our Patreon and our storefronts will be linked in the description. We wanted to say thank you so much for taking time out of your day to watch this video and maybe learn something new. If you like our content, we would love it if you liked, comment, and subscribed. And there's a little notification bell that you can hit down below, and if you click on that, it'll let you know when we upload new content for you to enjoy. And without further ado, let's hop right in to our video. First things first, let's start by gathering our tools and materials. As expected, we're going to need our faux fur in any color that you'd like. And then the next thing that we're going to need is a tail-based fabric. Minky works just fine for this. Fleece, we like to use quilted broadcloth. The next thing you're going to need is some nylon strap material. This will be for our belt loops. Anything from a 1/2 inch to 1 inch will work great. We're also going to need some sewing machine thread. My favorite brand is Gutterman, or just anything 100% polyester. Next up is some polyfill stuffing. This is going to help our tail maintain its nice round shape. We're also going to need to grab some EVA foam. The gym puzzle mat flooring in a 1/2 inch works great. The last item on our materials list is just a little bit of hot glue. We're going to use that for attaching our EVA foam to our tail base. As for tools, the first thing we're going to need is, of course, a nice sharp pair of scissors. These will come in handy for cutting fur. We're also going to need a curved hand sewing needle that we're going to use to ladder stitch at the very end. Speaking of sewing, one thing we do recommend is a sewing machine, but ultimately, if you're more comfortable with hand sewing, it is optional. The next thing up on our list is some wonder clips. These are my favorite thing for clipping together fur, but if you prefer to utilize sewing pins, you can absolutely use those instead. Also, be sure to grab a pet slicker brush. I like to use these to brush out seams and keep my fabric looking fresh. You're also going to need a tool to mark on fabric. We love Silver Sharpie or any sort of washable marker. The last item is going to be a craft knife or X-Acto knife to cut our EVA foam, but scissors also work just fine. If you have a pre-made pattern by us or another fursuit maker, you can start by printing it out scaled to 100% on any sort of standard printer paper. Tails are simple 2D shapes most of the time, and if you'd like to create your own tail pattern, it's super duper easy. All you'd need to do is create a life-sized 2-dimensional shape of exactly how you'd want that tail to look. Some big paper like butcher paper would be a really great option for designing your own tail, so you don't have to tape a bunch of smaller pieces of paper together. One of the handy things about our tail patterns is they're often pre-set up to have some simple markings, usually like 2 or 3 color tones. Most of the time on our tails, we have those color sets separated by A, B, and C style lettering, and then in between pattern pieces that need to connect, we have attached to. So like here, you see attached to A, B, or C, 1, 2, or 3, and those will help you align your pattern pieces. Our curly tails are probably the trickiest out of all of our tail patterns, and you'll notice we have some arrow markings on these patterns that indicate fur direction. With curly tails being as curly as they are, we need to have some of our pieces separated oftentimes to better articulate that fur direction. You'll notice here, for instance, that pieces B1 and B2, as well as A1 and A2, are separated from A3, B3, and B4. Double checking and being intentional about your fur direction is one of the easiest first steps that you can take to ensuring that any fursuit part you make turns out really nice. When we're laying out our pattern piece, we always want to make sure that those arrows on our pattern pieces align with the direction of our fur. You may notice here we made a slight oversight on our B4 piece, and I misaligned that arrow while designing the pattern. Don't worry, that's corrected in the final one, but we want to look at the B3 arrow to ensure that that B3 arrow is pointing in congruency with our fur direction. Because we are making a pattern that is intended to be symmetrical, as most tails are, every pattern piece will need to be traced twice. You'll notice here that we trace that initial piece before flipping it over, and now we're going to trace the back side of the piece. One of the handy things that we always end up doing is whenever we trace a piece with our text upwards, we write a little X on that side. That's going to help us later on when it comes to connecting all of our pieces to ensure that one side and the other side remains separate. The process of flipping these patterns is often referred to as reflecting, and I'm gonna sound like a broken record by the end of this video, I promise, but one of the most important things to keep in mind when we are reflecting our patterns is that we are following our arrows to ensure that we get that fur direction the same both times. It's tricky when you're first starting out to ensure that you are flipping those patterns in the right direction. Is it horizontal? Is it vertical? So long as when you flip them, the arrows are still pointing in congruency with our fur direction, you flipped it the right way. Now we're going to move into tracing our A pattern pieces. These pattern pieces are originally designed to be traced in a different color, but the beauty of patterns is they are largely up for user interpretation. The great thing about two-dimensional patterns like tails is that they're incredibly easy to edit and modify. Whether you're creating your own pattern or utilizing a pattern by us or another maker, all you have to do is take the entire pattern, tape it together if you're printing it out, or utilize the full one that you made yourself and draw on your very own markings to fit your character. So long as you make sure to add on some extra fur direction arrows so you don't lose that fur direction, you can go ahead and take your pattern pieces and trace them out on any color or length of fur that you like to best articulate your character. If you're cutting out fur for the first time, it can definitely be pretty tricky. Don't stress out, it's just important to take your time. The key to cutting fur is ensuring that your blade gets right up against the backing while you're cutting. Our goal is to avoid cutting the pile of the fur itself, and while some shedding is inevitable, you definitely want to make sure that you're not taking bites out of our fur pile. We find that the key to this is taking teeny tiny snips with a small pair of scissors and a sharp blade. Alright, it's time to bust out those wonder clips because our next step involves taking all of our little pieces and prepping them to sew. For most other projects, people will utilize little sewing pins for this, but I find with how thick and slippery fur is, wonder clips are the best choice to ensuring that we hold our pieces together and they stay in place while we're sewing them. As we're preparing to sew all of these pieces together, it's important to note that we want to sew together each half in its entirety before we sew the two halves together. This is where those X's come in handy, as you'll see here, is all of the X's are going to be on one side, and then all of the non-X's are going to be on the other side. It's easy to start with attaching all of the same colors on one side to one another before we go into attaching the different colors together. tails are one of the easiest things to sew when it comes to fursuit making. All you gotta do is take it under your sewing machine and run either a straight stitch or a zigzag stitch across it, whatever floats your boat and calls you captain. If you're choosing to hand sew these, that's absolutely an option. It will just take a little longer. I would recommend utilizing a blanket stitch. You very well may have noticed that we aren't using a bunch of seam allowance on our tails here. I am a firm believer that seam allowance is a personal journey. We don't include seam allowance in any of our patterns, and it is absolutely up to you if you want to add it. People who do like seam allowance tend to add anywhere from about 3 millimeters to 1/4 of an inch, but anything is good. Now that we've finished up sewing all of these side pieces together that are of the same color, it's time to move into sewing the two colors together. If you take a look at the pieces that Lauren is working on here in the clip that's currently running, you'll see that all of these individual pieces of fabric have X's written on them. That's what we mean when we say all of the X's are going to be on the same side. This pattern piece, on the other hand, has no X's on it. This is the piece that we traced with the text down, our secondary reflected piece. Those X's are super duper handy when it comes to ensuring that we don't accidentally attach a reflected piece to a non-reflected piece, because I promise they won't fit together. We also want to make sure as we're clipping these up that we're aligning seams that we know for a fact go together. You'll notice the seam in the middle connecting the two pieces that we originally had to have separate connects perfectly and is in line with one another. If you're worried about your ability to perfectly align these two pieces, I would recommend adding additional tick marks on the inside of those seams, as well as on the outside, so when we go to the part where we connect both of the halves together, you're able to easily line this up. This is even more helpful on tails that are longer, as it helps make sure that all of our pieces will perfectly align. Take your tail right on back over to the sewing machine and attach those two colored pieces together, ensuring that we're catching both sides of the fabric as we sew. This can be really hard. Even professional long-term seamstresses have a tricky time sewing up fur fabric. It's notoriously one of seamstresses' least favorite materials to work with. I know many of you watching this video are likely making your very first fursuit, and on top of that, I know a lot of people who make their very first fursuit actually haven't done a lot of sewing before. I really do want to emphasize that sewing fur is incredibly difficult, so you don't feel discouraged by your lack of success maybe the first time around. If you're getting frustrated sewing on a sewing machine, definitely move over to hand sewing. Again, it takes longer, but it's a really good skill to learn. Even people who have been around the block a few times, like us here in the Spilt Grape Soda office, make mistakes. It's super duper normal, and especially if you're just starting out. With my be patient with yourself, be kind to yourself soapbox moment out of the way, it's time to move on to taking our two tail halves and attaching them together. With tails, it's really important to start by clipping at the places that you know for sure are intended to go and attach to one another. You'll see Lauren going in and adding clips at places like seams that we know for sure are going to line up, and the start and end of colors and the start and end of the tail itself. I spoke very briefly earlier on about the idea of adding additional tick marks to both inside places where patterns connect together, as well as along the outside for attaching our two halves together. For smaller, more condensed tails, I personally don't find a need to add additional tick marks, but when it comes to longer, especially skinnier tails, I find those tick marks are absolutely invaluable. The longer your tail gets, the higher chance you have of slightly misaligning your pattern pieces. On smaller tails, this is less of a big deal because they're shorter and denser, but when you have big, long tails, if you slightly misalign those pattern pieces, the tail will begin to curve off to one side. This can be super frustrating on things like a duchy tail or a feline tail, where having it nice and straight is really important. Adding in tick marks to the outside especially will help subvert that curvature issue and will help make sure that your tail remains nice and smooth and straight. Once you've finished up your long-winded clippy journey, we're going to take our tail right back over to the sewing machine and sew up around the outside. You may have noticed right there that we're actually leaving an opening in the bottom of the tail. That opening should be the width of our tail base, which is going to be our next step in the process. That's going to be super duper handy and is actually going to be what we flip our tail right side out through. And so we want to make sure that the width is enough that we can get our EVA foam tail puck out through it successfully. As we finish sewing up our tail, the next thing that we'll need to do is prepare our tail base. If you have one of our patterns, a tail base is included in your pattern set, but if you're making your own pattern, you'll need to calculate out your tail base yourself. Our primary goal in determining our tail base revolves around finding a diameter measurement of the base of our tail. There's a few different ways to calculate diameter. You can either take the radius and multiply it by 2, take the circumference and divide it by pi, or divide the area by pi and then find the square root. We can't find the area too easily, and we also need the diameter to find the radius, so our key is using the circumference. Of course, at this point, we don't actually have the circumference, but don't worry, finding it's really easy. Take half of your tail and measure from the top to the bottom of our opening, where our base is going to be. Take that number and then multiply it by 2. Once you get that answer, that is actually going to be our circumference, which is the distance around our base. Now that we have that number, you can take and divide the circumference by pi, or 3.14. Once you have that number, that's your diameter. If you cut it in half, that's going to be your radius. Drawing out your tail base is actually super duper easy. We're going to take our diameter, in this example we're utilizing 4 inches, and we're going to trace that against a ruler. Also going to make sure that we mark the radius, or half of our diameter. In our case it's 2 inches. We're going to use that radius marking to center our circle around. Rotate your ruler around a few centimeters at a time, ensuring that that central radius marking remains in the middle of our measurement, and then mark the 0 and, in our case, the 4. Continue to rotate your ruler, marking that 0 as well as your total diameter marking until you have what looks to be a full circle. Once that's done, simply play connect the dots and you'll have your total circle. This can also be done with a compass, but if you don't have a compass, this is an easy way. Go ahead and grab a piece of quilted broadcloth in your tail base and trace around the outside of your pattern. Once you have your tail base all cut out and ready to go, grab some nylon webbing material. As a general rule of thumb, we like to add 2 separate smaller straps if a tail has a high center of gravity, and if a tail has a low center of gravity, we make sure to just add 1 thicker strap. This material has a habit of fraying on cut ends, so go ahead and grab a lighter or a blowtorch and seal off the ends with a little bit of heat. Once they're good to go, clip them in place and we're going to bring them right over to our sewing machine. Go ahead and secure those loose edges with a zigzag stitch. We also like to add some additional stitches in the center to ensure that there's just enough room for a belt, because this helps it stay a little more stable while you're wearing it. Once your tail base is good to go, we get to clip it right onto our tail. Make sure when you're attaching your tail base with these clips here that our straps are staying vertical. The last thing you want is to flip your tail right side out and notice that your straps are cattywampus. Bring it back over to your sewing machine and attach that base with a simple straight stitch. As you're sewing, just make sure that you're grabbing those nylon straps that we added on earlier in your stitching. To finish up our tail base, we'll need some EVA foam. Take and trace out your tail base shape right on top of that EVA foam and use a nice sharp pair of scissors to cut it out. Attaching it is really easy. Just use some hot glue and press it right onto our tail base fabric. Once the hot glue is dried, it's time to flip the tail right side out. I hope the hole you left is big enough for your EVA foam tail base to fit through, and this would be the moment that you noticed if it wasn't. Now that it's been flipped, you can go ahead and start adding polyfill stuffing. Generally, less dense is more better. You only need enough polyfill to make sure the tail maintains its shape. The more polyfill you add, the heavier your tail will become, and it will end up restricting the movement. Find that happy medium between holding its shape and not weighing yourself down. Once you've found that right amount of stuffing, it's time to ladder sew up that hole that we left earlier. We aren't going to go into a huge amount of detail on how to ladder sew, but there are some fantastic videos right here on YouTube that can teach you how to do this exact thing. It's a tricky stitch, take your time, but it's definitely worth it. Once you go ahead and tie off your ladder stitch and give your tail a really good brush over, you should be done and you should have a fully finished tail. Congratulations, bounce around, have some fun. You did it, you made a thing. Making a thing is always so cool. Now you get to enjoy it. Thank you so much for watching this video. We hope you learned something new. We wanted to give a special shout out to the folks on our Fursuit University tier on Patreon. Those names are going to be Teacup Lion, Luma, Shape Twitty, Hannah Cat, Sir Breakdown, Amy L, Slumber Yote, Willow, Toy Carnival Creations, Trost, Mariana E, Rapid Sparks, The Brandix, Freckled Cat, Mackenzie, Marcus D, Skiggles, Ratkip, and Mackay. It's with people like you that allow us to do what we love the most, which is teaching and making really cool art projects. If you have interest in seeing what we do on a weekly basis, or getting patterns, or even attending our Fursuit University classes, which are monthly Zoom classes about how to make fursuits, check out our Patreon. It's going to be linked down in the description. It's awesome. We highly recommend. It is so much fun. We have a blast every month. Or the other thing you can do, if you want to support us, check out our website. We now have a store on our website. We also have one on Etsy, but if you shop on our website, it helps us save a little bit because Etsy fees are kind of crazy. So we would love if you checked out our work on our website or on our Etsy store. Thank you so much again for watching this video and spending time with us. If you liked it, please like, comment, and subscribe, and hit that little notification bell so you know when we post new content. With that, we'll see you in the next video. Bye!